Most people building emergency food supplies take their cues from other preppers, which makes sense at first. But it overlooks the fact that agencies like FEMA and the U.S. Department of Agriculture have spent decades researching what actually belongs in a survival stockpile. They've studied food safety, long-term storage, and the nutritional requirements needed to stay healthy and functional when normal supply chains fail. Even so, that guidance is often ignored. FEMA's official recommendations are publicly available, and the USDA Extension Service provides extensive research on food preservation. But these sources rarely shape mainstream prepper discussions. Instead, the space is dominated by flashy content, showing bunker setups and expensive freeze-dried meals that aren't realistic for most households. After more than 10 years of building my own food storage system, one clear lesson stands out. The simple, unremarkable foods recommended by government agencies are often the most effective. They're not popular because they're exciting. They're popular because they work. They're affordable, long-lasting when stored correctly, and usually already part of a typical kitchen. Currently, the standard recommendation is for households to keep at least 2 weeks of food on hand, up from the older 72-hour guideline. That change reflects real-world disasters where recovery took far longer than expected. While 2 weeks is the minimum, many experts recommend aiming for 3 months, and more serious planners often work toward a full year of supplies. Getting to that level of preparedness doesn't require expensive survival kits. It comes from knowing which everyday foods store well, provide real nutrition, and remain practical to eat under stress. Let's go through 15 of those foods. Some will be familiar, others may be surprising, and I'll also include practical storage tips based on common mistakes people make along the way. The first item is honey, and it may honestly be one of the most extraordinary foods on the entire list. Archaeologists have even discovered sealed jars of honey inside ancient Egyptian tombs that are more than 3,000 years old, and incredibly, they were still safe to eat. Not probably fine in a survival scenario, but genuinely edible in a practical sense. In theory, you could open one of those jars today and spread it on toast without any issue. The reason honey doesn't spoil comes down to its unique chemistry. Its natural water content stays below roughly 18%, which is too low for most bacteria to grow or survive. On top of that, honey is highly acidic, typically ranging between a pH of about 3.2 and 4.5, creating an environment that's hostile to most microorganisms right away. During production, bees also introduce an enzyme called glucose oxidase, which can produce tiny amounts of hydrogen peroxide when honey is diluted, adding another layer of natural antimicrobial protection. What really makes honey stand out in a survival context, though, isn't just its nearly indefinite shelf life. It's how useful it is in everyday situations. As a sweetener, it's obvious, but it's also a fast source of energy because it's essentially simple sugars that your body can absorb almost instantly. That's exactly why athletes often use honey during endurance activities. It delivers quick fuel when it's needed most. In an emergency scenario where physical effort is higher than normal, that rapid energy boost becomes genuinely valuable. Honey also has a long history as a medicinal tool. Long before modern antibiotics existed, it was widely used to treat wounds, not as superstition, but because it actually works. Its antibacterial properties, combined with the protective layer it forms over injuries, help reduce infection risk and support healing. Even today, some medical professionals still use medical-grade honey for burn care and wound treatment, since it can outperform certain synthetic options in specific cases. The main mistake people make with honey is improper storage, especially when it comes to moisture. Honey is hygroscopic, meaning it actively absorbs water from the air. If the container is left open or stored in a humid environment, the moisture content can rise above 20%, which can eventually lead to fermentation. The fix is simple. Keep it tightly sealed and protected from humidity. If your honey crystallizes over time, which is completely normal, that doesn't mean it's gone bad. It just means the natural sugars have separated from the liquid. A gentle, warm water bath will bring it back to its smooth, liquid form without any loss in quality. For storage, glass containers are ideal because they're completely non-reactive and airtight when sealed properly. Plastic can work, but over long periods it may allow slight air exchange. Honey itself is stable either way, but glass offers the most reliable long-term protection. One final note: both raw and processed honey have an indefinite shelf life when stored correctly. However, raw honey generally preserves more of its natural enzymes and beneficial compounds, making it the better option when available. Either way, though, honey is one of the rare foods that truly doesn't expire. The second item is white rice, and this is one of those cases where official guidance actually aligns with long-term survival logic in a way that can feel a bit surprising at first. On paper, brown rice is the more nutritious option. It contains more fiber, higher levels of B vitamins, and additional minerals because it still has the bran layer intact. For everyday eating, especially when nutrition is the priority, brown rice is often the better choice. But that same bran layer is also what causes the problem. It contains natural oils, and those oils eventually break down and go rancid. Because of that, brown rice has a relatively short storage life, around 6 months at room temperature in most cases, and maybe up to about 18 months if it's carefully vacuum sealed and frozen. White rice, on the other hand, behaves completely differently. When properly stored, it can remain usable for decades. In fact, studies from places like the Utah State University Extension have shown that white rice kept under stable conditions, especially with oxygen absorbers, can maintain quality for 10 years or more. And in ideal dry, cool environments, its shelf life can stretch much further. This is where the mindset shift matters. Emergency food storage isn't about achieving the perfect diet. It's about ensuring you still have something to eat when normal systems fail. The goal is reliability, not optimization. In that context, white rice becomes far more valuable because it will still be edible years down the line, while brown rice may no longer be safe or palatable. The practical storage method is also straightforward. You buy rice in larger quantities, transfer it into food-grade buckets or mylar bags, add appropriately sized oxygen absorbers, and then seal everything tightly. After that, storage conditions do most of the work. A cool, dark place is ideal, whether that's a closet, under a bed, or a basement if you have one. The key enemies you're trying to protect against are moisture, heat, oxygen, and light. If you control those factors, the rice essentially stops aging in any meaningful way. From a nutrition standpoint, rice is also extremely efficient. 1 pound of uncooked white rice can yield roughly 1,600 calories once cooked, which is a substantial amount of energy from a very inexpensive food source. A 50-pound bag alone represents around 80,000 calories, enough, in purely caloric terms, to sustain a single person for about a month, if it were their only food. Of course, no one should rely on rice alone long-term, but that level of calorie density per cost is hard to beat. Another advantage is its versatility. Rice doesn't have a strong or overpowering flavor, which means it can take on almost anything you cook with it. That adaptability becomes more important than people expect when you're eating stored foods for extended periods and need variety just to stay sane. If you've been trying to build your own food storage system, I've also put together a simple, structured approach called the $50 Food Plan. It breaks down how to build a 90-day supply from almost nothing, including exact amounts and storage methods. It's available through the link in the description if you want to take a closer look. The third item is salt, and it's one of those essentials that people often underestimate simply because it's so common. It's sitting in nearly every kitchen, it's incredibly cheap, and because of that familiarity, it rarely gets the attention it deserves in preparedness planning. But in reality, salt is one of the most valuable long-term storage items you can have. Pure salt doesn't really expire. Sodium chloride in its basic form will outlast generations. It doesn't go bad, break down, or lose its core properties over time. The only real issue you might run into is clumping if it pulls in moisture from the air. Even then, it's not a loss in quality or safety. You just break it apart and it's as usable as ever. Historically, salt has played a much bigger role than just flavoring food. For thousands of years, it was one of humanity's primary preservation tools. Before refrigeration existed, salt was essential for keeping meat from spoiling. In fact, in ancient Rome, soldiers were sometimes compensated with salt rations, which is where the term salary is often traced back to. That alone gives you an idea of how valuable it once was. Salt wasn't just a commodity. It was a form of currency because it directly affected whether people could survive through seasons when fresh food wasn't available. In a prolonged emergency where modern refrigeration systems fail or become unreliable, Salt returns to that same critical role. It allows you to preserve food using traditional methods. By packing meat in salt, you can draw out moisture and create conditions that inhibit bacterial growth. With vegetables, salt brining makes pickling possible, and that in turn opens the door to foods like cucumbers, preserved as pickles, or cabbage turned into sauerkraut. Beyond simply lasting longer, these foods can also develop beneficial probiotics through fermentation, which adds nutritional value rather than just extending shelf life. Salt also plays an important biological role in the human body. It's essential for maintaining electrolyte balance. When you're doing physical labor or dealing with stress in a survival situation, you lose sodium through sweat. If you don't replace it, you can quickly start to feel symptoms like fatigue, headaches, and muscle cramps, and in more severe cases, it can lead to serious health complications. Having a reliable salt supply lets you manage that balance directly. When it comes to storage strategy, it's smart to keep more than one type. Small amounts of iodized table salt are useful for everyday cooking, and the iodine is important because it helps prevent thyroid issues, which can become a real concern in long-term situations where diet variety is limited. Alongside that, it's practical to store larger quantities of canning salt or kosher salt. These are typically free of additives, which makes them better suited for fermentation, curing, and long-term food preservation work. From a cost perspective, salt is almost unbeatable. A large 25-pound bag can often be found for around $10 and takes up very little space. Yet that small investment can support large-scale food preservation efforts, from curing meats to fermenting vegetables. When you look at it through that lens, the value it provides compared to its cost is extremely high. The fourth item is dried beans, and if there's one category that really stands out in terms of value for money and overall usefulness, this is it. Whether you're talking about lentils, black beans, pinto beans, kidney beans, navy beans, or chickpeas, they all share the same core advantage from a storage standpoint. They last an exceptionally long time when kept dry and properly sealed. With oxygen absorbers and good storage conditions, many varieties can remain viable for 25 to even 30 years. Nutritionally, beans are incredibly dense. They're high in protein, high in fiber, and extremely satisfying in terms of fullness. On average, a single pound of dried beans provides roughly 1,500 calories along with over 100 grams of protein, all for a very low cost, often under $2 per pound and sometimes even closer to $1 when purchased in bulk. It's hard to find any other grocery item that delivers that level of nutrition for such a small price. From a dietary perspective, beans offer a powerful combination of complex carbohydrates for steady energy, fiber that supports digestion, and plant-based protein that helps maintain and repair muscle. When you combine beans with rice, you get something even more important: a complete protein profile containing all essential amino acids your body needs. That pairing isn't accidental or cultural coincidence. It's basic nutritional efficiency, which is why so many traditional cuisines around the world rely on rice and bean combinations. The main thing to understand with beans is that they do require preparation time and water. Most dried beans need to be soaked first, usually overnight or for about 4 to 8 hours, and then cooked slowly for anywhere from 1 to 2 hours depending on the type. That means your preparedness plan also has to account for fuel or heat sources and a reliable way to boil water for extended periods. Lentils are a useful exception because they don't require soaking at all. You can go straight from dry to cooked in roughly 20 to 30 minutes, which makes them especially valuable in situations where fuel is limited or time matters. Red lentils cook even faster, sometimes in as little as 15 minutes, though they tend to break down into a softer texture as they cook. One of the most common mistakes people make when storing beans is underestimating how much oxygen exposure matters. Beans left in their original grocery packaging might stay usable for a few years, but they won't hold up for decades. To truly extend their shelf life to the 25 to 30-year range, they should be transferred into mylar bags with oxygen absorbers or sealed in food-grade buckets with tight-fitting gamma lids. Removing oxygen is key because it slows down oxidation and also prevents insect eggs from developing over time. The fifth item is oats, and they sit in a really useful middle ground that's hard to beat when it comes to long-term food storage. When stored correctly, oats can last for years, and in oxygen-free environments, they can remain good for up to around 30 years. They're also very affordable, usually costing about $1 per pound for standard rolled oats, which makes them one of the most budget-friendly staples you can stockpile. What also makes oats stand out is how little effort they require compared to other grains. Unlike whole wheat berries, which need to be ground into flour before you can really use them, oats are essentially ready to go as is. On top of that, they bring solid nutritional value, especially in terms of fiber. One of their key components is beta-glucan, a type of soluble fiber that helps stabilize blood sugar levels and keeps you feeling full for a long time after eating. That sense of fullness becomes especially important in emergency situations, where you might be burning more energy through physical activity but still dealing with limited food intake. In those conditions, foods that provide steady energy and satiety become incredibly useful. Oats are most commonly associated with breakfast in the form of oatmeal, but their usefulness actually extends far beyond that. They can be mixed into baked goods to improve texture and boost nutrition, ground into a rough flour for things like pancakes or simple breads, or used as a binder in recipes like meatloaf or vegetable patties. They can even be added directly into soups to help thicken them, or stretched further into homemade granola bars when combined with ingredients like honey and dried fruit. In terms of storage types, the rolled oats you typically find in grocery stores are a strong all-around option. These are oat groats that have been steamed and flattened, which helps them cook faster while still storing well. Steel-cut oats are less processed and simply chopped groats, which gives them a slightly longer shelf life due to less exposed surface area, but they take much longer to cook, often around 45 minutes. Quick oats are processed even further so they cook in about a minute, but they tend to become mushier in texture. For most storage purposes, standard rolled oats strike the best balance between shelf life, cooking time, and versatility. The storage method is straightforward. Keep them in airtight containers with oxygen absorbers and store them in a cool, dark place. A typical 5-gallon bucket can hold about 25 pounds of oats, which adds up to roughly 45,000 calories, enough to cover a substantial number of meals, especially breakfasts over time. The sixth item is peanut butter, and this is where calorie density really starts to matter in a big way. A typical serving of peanut butter, about 2 teaspoons, contains roughly 190 calories, and most of those calories come from a combination of fats and protein. In an emergency situation, especially one where you're more physically active but still dealing with limited food intake, fats become incredibly important. They're a highly concentrated energy source. Your body relies on them not just for fuel, but also for hormone production, vitamin absorption, brain function, and maintaining steady, long-lasting energy output. A lot of emergency foods tend to be heavy on carbohydrates, things like rice, beans, pasta, oats, and bread. Those are all important staples, but carbohydrates generally provide quick-burning energy. Fat, on the other hand, digests more slowly and delivers a steadier release of energy over time. Having fat-based foods in your supply helps balance things out and improves overall endurance. Peanut butter itself is also fairly shelf-stable compared to many other foods. Unopened commercial jars typically last anywhere from about 2 to 5 years, depending on the brand and formulation. Versions with added stabilizers and preservatives usually hold up longer than natural peanut butter made only from peanuts and salt. While natural peanut butter is often considered cleaner, it tends to separate more easily and can spoil faster, which makes the stabilized versions more practical for long-term storage. One of the biggest advantages of peanut butter from a practical standpoint is convenience. It requires no preparation at all. You don't need water, cooking, or any equipment. In a situation where resources are limited or cooking isn't possible, you can just open the jar and eat it directly. It can be spread on crackers, eaten by the spoonful, or used however you need it in the moment. For storage, the key factor is temperature. The oils in peanut butter can go rancid when exposed to heat over time, so it's best kept in a cool, dark place. Areas like garages or attics that experience high temperatures in summer are not ideal. Instead, a pantry, cupboard, or closet inside your living space is usually a much safer option. It can also be smart to diversify your fat sources rather than relying on just one item. Almond butter, sunflower seed butter, and other nut or seed butters can serve similar purposes nutritionally and add variety to your storage. That variety isn't just about nutrition, it also helps with long-term morale, since eating the same thing repeatedly for months can become mentally exhausting. The seventh item is canned fish, with tuna and salmon being the most common choices, along with sardines, mackerel, and anchovies. The main advantage here is simple but extremely important. Shelf-stable, ready-to-eat protein. Most protein sources don't store well without refrigeration. Fresh meat spoils within days, frozen meat depends entirely on a constant electricity supply, and even dried options like jerky only last a few months under normal conditions. Canned fish, by contrast, can sit safely on a shelf for roughly 3 to 5 years while still providing high-quality, complete protein along with beneficial omega-3 fatty acids. The protein content alone makes it highly valuable. A single can of tuna can contain around 40 to 50 grams of protein, which is a significant portion of, or in some cases nearly all of, the daily protein needs for an average person depending on body size and activity level. And one of its biggest advantages is convenience. It's fully edible straight out of the can. No cooking, no heating, no preparation, just open it and eat. This is exactly why canned proteins are consistently included in government emergency food guidelines. The body can't maintain muscle mass or proper immune function on carbohydrates alone. Protein is essential for tissue repair, strength maintenance, and overall physical resilience. In stressful situations where physical activity may increase while overall food intake decreases, protein needs often go up rather than down. Canned fish is one of the simplest ways to meet that requirement. Beyond protein, certain types of fish, especially salmon, sardines, and mackerel, provide omega-3 fatty acids which support brain function, reduce inflammation, and help maintain cardiovascular health. In a long-term disruption scenario, access to fresh seafood or high-quality supplements would likely be limited, so canned fish becomes a very practical substitute for those nutrients. Sardines, in particular, deserve extra attention because they are among the most nutrient-dense foods available in canned form. Their small size means they accumulate far less mercury than larger fish species, and their soft, edible bones provide an additional source of calcium. They're also usually very affordable, often costing less than $2 per can, which makes them an efficient option for building reserves. Canned fish is also highly versatile. It can be mixed into rice or pasta, served on crackers, turned into a simple fish salad with condiments like mayonnaise or mustard, or eaten plain when nothing else is available. That flexibility makes it useful in a wide range of situations, which is exactly what you want in emergency food storage. The eighth item is powdered milk, and it's one of those foods that tends to get overlooked simply because it doesn't sound appealing. Fresh milk obviously tastes better, so most people don't think of powdered milk as something they'd rely on. But in terms of long-term storage, it plays a very important role. Fresh milk requires constant refrigeration and only lasts a few days before it spoils. Powdered milk, on the other hand, can remain stable for decades when it's properly stored in cool, dry, airtight conditions. We're talking about shelf lives of 20 years or more in the right setup, which is genuinely significant for a dairy product. Once it's rehydrated with water, powdered milk still provides key nutrients like calcium, protein, and a range of vitamins that can be difficult to consistently obtain in an emergency food system. Calcium is crucial for bone strength and proper nerve function. Protein supports muscle maintenance and repair, and fortified versions of powdered milk often include vitamin D, which helps the body absorb calcium and also supports immune health. In a long-term situation without regular access to fresh dairy, those nutrients can become harder to replace than many people realize. Taste is usually the biggest drawback. Most people won't confuse reconstituted powdered milk with fresh milk. The drying process changes the proteins and affects the texture and flavor. That said, it performs much better when it's used as an ingredient rather than consumed on its own. It can be mixed into oatmeal, added to coffee or tea, used in baking for things like bread or pancakes, or incorporated into creamy soups and sauces. In those kinds of recipes, it blends in well enough that you barely notice any difference. For families, especially those with children, powdered milk becomes even more important. Growing kids need steady calcium intake to support bone development, and they're more vulnerable to nutritional gaps if fresh food isn't available. Having a long-term dairy substitute on hand can provide a real sense of security in that regard. And if you're trying to figure out how to store all of this in a practical way, especially in smaller living spaces, There are structured approaches that focus specifically on maximizing limited storage areas without needing a full basement or large pantry. The ninth item is pasta, and it shares many of the same strengths as rice while adding something just as important: variety. When stored correctly in a dry, sealed environment, dried pasta can last around 25 to 30 years. It's also very affordable, typically costing under $2 per pound. Like rice, it's calorie-dense and provides a reliable source of carbohydrates for energy. 1 pound of pasta contains roughly 1,600 calories, which is essentially the same range as rice, making it equally effective from a purely nutritional standpoint. Where pasta really stands out is in how it changes the eating experience. Even if rice and pasta offer similar nutrition, they don't feel the same to eat. The texture is different, the way meals are structured changes, and the overall sensory experience is completely distinct. That matters more than people often realize. If someone eats rice every day for months, fatigue sets in, not just physically, but mentally. Introducing pasta into the rotation breaks that monotony and makes the overall food supply feel less repetitive. That psychological benefit is a big deal in long-term situations. Food isn't just fuel, it also plays a role in morale. When everything around you is stressful or uncertain, having a meal that feels familiar or comforting can make a noticeable difference in how well you cope. Something like spaghetti with canned sauce can feel much closer to a normal meal than a plain bowl of rice, and that sense of normalcy can be surprisingly grounding. Pasta also has a practical advantage when it comes to cooking time. It generally cooks faster than rice, often becoming ready in about 10 to 12 minutes of boiling. Rice, depending on the type, can take 20 minutes or more. In a situation where fuel is limited, whether that's propane, firewood, or another heat source, those extra minutes matter. Less cooking time means less energy used for the same amount of calories. Another benefit is the variety of shapes and how they can change meal options without affecting storage needs. Long pasta like spaghetti or linguine works well with simple sauces, while shapes like penne or rotini are better at holding thicker or chunkier sauces. Macaroni is ideal for baked dishes or pasta-based casseroles, and smaller shapes like orzo can even stand in for rice and soups or mixed dishes. The shape doesn't change how you store it, but it does expand what you can do with it. In the end, storing both rice and pasta isn't redundant. It's intentional. They overlap in purpose, but offer enough differences in use, cooking, and experience that having both significantly improves flexibility and long-term sustainability. The 10th item is canned vegetables, and this is one of those categories that many people either underestimate or leave out entirely when building emergency food supplies. It's true that fresh vegetables are nutritionally superior, and frozen vegetables generally retain more vitamins than canned ones. However, both of those options rely on conditions that may not be available in an emergency. Fresh produce depends on a stable supply chain, and frozen foods depend on continuous electricity. Canned vegetables don't require either of those things, which is exactly what makes them valuable. Common options include corn, green beans, carrots, peas, tomatoes, spinach, and beets. The exact type matters less than the broader goal, which is simply having reliable vegetable sources in storage. These foods provide dietary fiber for digestion, vitamins that support immune function and tissue repair, and minerals that are involved in everything from nerve signaling to oxygen transport in the body. Most canned vegetables have a shelf life of about 3 to 5 years, sometimes longer if stored properly. They're also ready to eat straight from the can if necessary, although they tend to taste better when heated. Another advantage is cost, especially when bought on sale or from discount stores, where cans can often be found for around $1 or even less. A common mistake in preparedness planning is focusing only on calories and ignoring nutritional balance. The goal isn't just to avoid starvation, it's to maintain basic health and functioning. Your body still needs vitamins, minerals, and fiber, even in a crisis, and vegetables are one of the simplest ways to cover those needs. Tomatoes are especially worth highlighting because of their versatility. Canned diced tomatoes can form the base for a wide range of meals. Tomato sauce can completely transform simple pasta dishes, and tomato paste adds depth and richness to soups and stews. They also contain lycopene, an antioxidant that becomes even more bioavailable when tomatoes are cooked, making canned forms particularly useful. A smart strategy is to rotate canned vegetables into your normal cooking routine rather than leaving them untouched. Using older cans first and replacing them as you go ensures nothing goes to waste while keeping your storage constantly refreshed and up to date. The 11th item is powdered eggs, and it's arguably one of the most overlooked essentials in long-term food storage. Fresh eggs are incredibly useful in everyday cooking. They show up in almost everything: breakfast dishes, baking, recipes that need binding, sauces, and even things like egg wash for bread. The problem is their shelf life. In a refrigerator, fresh eggs typically last only about 3 to 5 weeks, and without refrigeration, they can spoil in as little as a week or two. Powdered eggs change that equation completely. When properly packaged and stored, they can last anywhere from 5 to 10 years. A single number 10 can of powdered eggs can also represent the equivalent of roughly 70 to 100 whole eggs, which is a surprisingly high level of storage efficiency when you think about it in terms of both protein and volume. When rehydrated and cooked, powdered eggs can be scrambled into something that's fairly close to fresh eggs in taste and texture. It's not an exact match, but it's more than good enough for practical use. They also perform extremely well in baking, where most people wouldn't notice any difference at all. On top of that, they can be mixed into other meals to boost protein content, effectively replacing fresh eggs in nearly any recipe where they're used as an ingredient rather than the main focus. One of their biggest advantages is how much variety they add to emergency meals, especially breakfast. Many long-term storage foods tend to cluster around lunch and dinner staples, while breakfast options can become repetitive very quickly. Eating oatmeal every single morning, for example, gets old fast. Powdered eggs help solve that problem by making it possible to prepare scrambled eggs, pancakes, or even add egg into dishes like fried rice, giving you a much-needed sense of variety and normalcy in daily meals. The 12th item is cornmeal, and it's especially valuable because of how flexible it is and because it comes from a different grain tradition than wheat-based staples. Cornmeal can be used to make a wide range of foods with very little complexity. It's the base for cornbread, which doesn't require yeast and bakes relatively quickly. It can be turned into polenta, which is essentially a simple corn porridge, often seasoned or enriched with other ingredients. With the right technique, it can also be used to make tortillas. Beyond that, it shows up in foods like corn muffins, hush puppies, and Johnny cakes, and it can even be used as a coating for frying, adding texture and crunch to other dishes. In terms of storage, cornmeal doesn't last quite as long as whole wheat flour, but it still holds up reasonably well. When stored properly in airtight containers and kept away from heat and moisture, it can last around 2 years and sometimes longer if oxygen absorbers are used. There is also a difference between types. Whole grain cornmeal contains more natural oils and nutrients but has a shorter shelf life, while degerminated cornmeal has had the oil-rich parts removed, allowing it to store significantly longer. What makes cornmeal especially useful in an emergency food system isn't just nutrition, it's variety. Many staple foods can start to feel repetitive over time. Eating rice day after day can become monotonous, but rotating between rice, cornbread, tortillas, and other corn-based dishes creates a much more natural and less repetitive eating pattern. That kind of variety has a real psychological impact, helping meals feel more normal and less restrictive. Cornmeal also adds a slightly different nutritional profile compared to wheat. It's naturally gluten-free, which can be important for people with gluten sensitivity or dietary restrictions. It contains compounds like zeaxanthin, which support eye health, and it contributes a different balance of amino acids compared to wheat-based staples. While it isn't a complete protein on its own, it helps diversify overall nutrition when combined with other stored foods. The 13th item is dried fruit, and it falls into what you could call a morale food category. Morale foods aren't chosen because they're the most calorie-efficient or the cheapest option per pound. Instead, their value comes from how they make long-term emergency eating feel more human and less restrictive. In other words, they help food feel enjoyable rather than purely functional. Dried fruit fits that role perfectly because it satisfies something many other shelf-stable foods don't: the craving for sweetness. Whether it's raisins, dried apricots, dried apples, cranberries, or mango, the exact type is less important than simply having a sweet option available. After several days or weeks of eating staples like rice, beans, pasta, and canned vegetables, Even a small handful of dried fruit can feel like a genuine treat. That psychological effect shouldn't be underestimated. Preparedness isn't just about surviving worst-case scenarios, it's also about maintaining a sense of stability and normalcy. Knowing you've accounted for the basics brings peace of mind, and foods like this help support that mindset. This becomes even more important for children, who tend to experience stress differently than adults, and often rely more heavily on comfort foods to feel secure. From a nutritional standpoint, dried fruit also has real value. It provides fiber, vitamins, and quick energy from natural sugars, so it's not just empty comfort food despite its role in morale. Shelf life depends heavily on how it's processed and stored. Most properly dried fruits will last about 1 to 2 years under good conditions, while commercially packaged versions with preservatives can last longer. The most important factor is keeping them sealed and protected from moisture, since humidity can cause them to become sticky and eventually spoil or grow mold. Dried fruit is also more versatile than it might seem at first. It can be mixed into oatmeal, baked into bread, or combined with nuts to create trail mix. So while it works well as a snack, it also integrates easily into other meals, adding both flavor and variety.